It's Veterans Day 2013. My name is David Saltzman. I have been very lucky to serve as the executive director of Robin Hood since our founding 25 years ago. This is the first in what we hope will be a long series of conversations about the work that Robin Hood does. I'm going to sit with my colleague and dear friend Eric Weingartner today and talk about Robin Hood's work to serve the city's veterans. Eric, tell us a little bit about how many veterans there are in New York City.
In New York State, there are about 1 million veterans, and in New York City, about 250,000 that live in the 5 boroughs.
Robin Hood has always served veterans. We serve them, though, as poor people. So when a veteran or anybody else would show up hungry and in need of food, we'd support a soup kitchen or a food pantry that would feed them. Yeah. If a veteran or any other poor person showed up as homeless and in need of shelter, we'd make sure they had a roof over their head. What changed? Why did we decide that we should serve veterans as veterans in particular?
Beginning in 2008 and 2009, we noticed a surge in the number of veterans and their families relying on Robin Hood's programs. We noticed it particularly in our soup kitchens, in our pantries, in our job training programs, and in our shelters and supportive housing programs. And we knew that we had to be responsive to that change in demographic and the uptick in the number of veterans being served by our programs.
Were you seeing an uptick, a surge in the number of people who had served in Afghanistan and Iraq who were coming home and were lost?
What's surprising to many people about who needs help in New York City that are veterans is that it's not one population. There are lots of veterans who've served in Vietnam and Korea that have for many, many years struggled with housing, with employment, with substance abuse issues, and issues around being disconnected from behavioral health support. But then we also saw a new population of veterans, including post 9/11 veterans, guys that served in Afghanistan and Iraq and their families, who were newly homeless, were newly disconnected from jobs. In fact, the rate of unemployment for men and women who'd served post 9/11 was sometimes triple their counterparts that hadn't served.
We had a conversation with Admiral Mullen, who at the time was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that.
In January 2011, Admiral Mullen came to Robin Hood with his staff and helped us understand the landscape and the struggle that veterans and their families were having nationally and in New York. And he came to us in part because he knew that the Department of Defense had limited capacity to effectively transition veterans and their families.
Talk about that backlog. So a young man or a young woman returns from serving in Iraq or Afghanistan.
Right.
They recognize that they need help.
Yeah.
What's the backlog like for them?
It takes sometimes upwards of a year for benefits claims to go through the VA, which will in fact give you the green light to get medical services at the VA. An entire year to wait for a critical healthcare issue, critical mental health issue. 1 year.
Tell us about the programs that Robin Hood supports.
One of our first grantees actually provides internet-based telehealth behavioral health services where veterans don't have to wait but 1 day to get services through psychiatrists, psychologists that we're delivering health care by the internet or via phone. That's available to vets now, and there's no need to wait for the backlog.
So instead of a 1 year wait, there is a no-day wait.
That's right, that's right.
But what about their families? Are they supposed to be getting stuff?
One of the things that Admiral Mullen talked to us about from the very beginning was that families and kids of veterans are excluded from services, and that Robin Hood had to think about how do we include families when we think about healthcare, when we think about social services. In particular, we were worried about depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress with the spouses and kids of veterans that had served. Currently, under the way that the VA provides services to veterans, spouses and kids are not included in those benefits. So we started a brand new clinic for veterans and their families at NYU Hospital with a very important psychiatrist named Dr. Charlie Marmar. The structure of that clinic was that we would take the veterans' families and for free give them top-notch psychiatric and behavioral health services to treat depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress. We did it in partnership with the VA. And since we've started, over 350 families have used that clinic to treat undiagnosed and untreated depression and anxiety.
So officers are doing fine, right? It's the enlisted men and women who were having a tougher time in general. Is that a fair way, in rough terms, to break it out for people?
Many officers had an easier time transitioning into the private sector if they were able to work, meaning that physically, from a behavioral health standpoint, they were ready to transition. But we worried most about the soldiers and their families, where either from a training perspective, from a healthcare perspective, from a housing perspective, there were vulnerabilities about vets and their families that made it hard for them, particularly, to transition into the private sector.
It seems to me that an awful lot of the people that we're helping now are the types of people that we would have helped before they entered the service.
That's exactly right. We are focused on the men and women that enlisted predominantly, and oftentimes some that were part of the National Guard, who were called up when we went into an expanded role in Iraq and Afghanistan. We're dealing with folks that have very limited collegiate experience and folks that have very limited training into a skill that's easily translated into the private sector.
We had a conversation with Admiral Mullen, and he asked us to partner with him to make New York City really a model for the rest of the country when it came to serving veterans, and a model of public-private partnerships. Yeah. So we decided we'd raise a separate fund to help veterans. At our benefit, we had 4,000 people come together, and we raised a fund of about $13 million. But we wanted to have impact beyond that $13 million. So what did we do? You did such a terrific job leading our efforts. What did you do?
Before the benefit, we spent a lot of time canvassing the country for best practices in terms of how communities had served veterans effectively and what particular programs, what approaches had worked best. We were discouraged to learn that there weren't a lot of best practices, and there weren't a lot of groups that were dedicated to serving veterans on their own, where we could in turn invest in New York. Some of the programs that we started were aimed to do big and large-scale recruitment of veterans, where we could then in turn refer vets to positions that our corporate partners had made available to Robin Hood and more broadly. Let me give you a few examples that we're particularly proud of. Right after we raised the fund at our benefit, we immediately turned to the City of New York and some of our best homeless services providers to think about how can we move every street homeless veteran into shelter in New York City. We expanded the street outreach programs with the City of New York and Common Ground, Goddard Riverside, Bowery Residence Committee, some of Robin Hood's long-standing terrific homeless services providers, and essentially changed the model that they were using to do street outreach.
One of the things all of us found most disturbing, most shameful, was seeing young men and young women who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan sleeping on the streets of New York City.
David, according to the City of New York, there were about 3,000 homeless veterans when we started in 2011.
3,000 people who raised their hands to serve
That's right.
us found themselves coming home and ending up on the streets of New York City. You've done such important work here. It's some of the work that I'm proudest of, and I think all of us at Robin Hood are proudest of. How many veterans will be sleeping on the streets of New York when we finish the work of our Veterans Initiative?
This November, we hope to be the first big city in the country to have 0 veterans sleeping on the street. Over the course of the last 3 years, we've prioritized and expanded our role in outreach programs to find veterans who are sleeping on the street and move them into shelter and or housing.
That's fantastic.
It's incredibly inspiring work. Just last week, we had the City of New York, the Veterans Administration, and 10 of our grantees sitting in a room going through a list of every single remaining street homeless veteran in New York City, going through an action plan about what it'll take by Veterans Day to move every last one of them into shelter.
So they were going name by name.
Name by name.
They knew that Mr. or Ms. X was living in this park or on this subway.
That's right.
And they knew what it would take in terms of mental health services, in terms of shelter, in terms of everything else that was needed to help pull that person off the street. That's a terrific model, not just for New York City, but for the entire country, and one that I think we might be able to apply to all of the homeless people who are living on the street.
That's absolutely right. We've been talking to the Veterans Administration, we've been talking to the City of New York and other cities about this model precisely, because this is what it takes if we're serious about moving street homeless people. To date, we've spent about $10 million through 25 grants. In that time, we've placed over 1,500 veterans in jobs. We've connected over 1,000 veterans to legal services that have restored their benefits. We've helped 750 veterans penetrate the VA to get health care and food stamps and housing vouchers that have led to permanent placement in housing. We've helped over 400 veterans stay in college and persist against the GI Bill to move towards graduation.
Eric, thanks so much. You did an amazing job. Robin Hood at its best. Truly appreciate it. This is the first of these conversations. We'd love to get your feedback. Please send us a comment or give us a call and let us know what you thought worked, what you thought we could do better. Thank you for making this work possible. Thank you most of all to our veterans for serving our country so well. We're happy that we were able to give back in some small way.